IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. My name is Rohan Seth. I am joined here today by the topic we're going to discuss today, internet shutdowns. The standing committee in the Parliament the IT standing committee has come up with a report on the issue. And I think Prateek and Sapni are the finest people to talk about this, if only because Prateek has subject matter expertise here and Sapni is one of the best legal explainers that I have come across. So this brings us to sort of laying the context. But before I do that, if you're interested in the kind of stuff we talk about in this podcast, you might want to consider joining Takstashila's courses, specifically our tech and policy course, where we discuss more on this. Prateek and Sapni are both heavily involved and interact with the students. And so we'll leave a link in the show notes. Having said that, let's begin. So we've got this report, and I think it's quite stunning because the context it comes in and the stuff that it says, and more importantly, the stuff that it doesn't say, both of them are equally important. So I want to start with you, Prateek. Tell me a little bit about this report, the context around it, and then we'll talk about its implications.
Yeah, so this has been in the works for a while, and I remember the day pretty clearly that I think the Parliamentary Standing Committee took notice of this subject in their agenda as something that they want to study. Incidentally, it happened to be, I think, sometime in early 2020 when we were having a workshop for the GCPP in our office. But anyway, that little digression aside, the idea basically was that this was early 2020. If you remember, right, you had an internet shutdown in Jammu and Kashmir that had been going on for a while. You had the anti-CA protests because of which a number of internet shutdowns were imposed in different parts of the country. It was also done specifically, just around the time of the Supreme Court verdict on the Ayodhya case, right? There were a bunch of proactive or preemptive internet shutdowns that were enacted in different parts of the country, right? So it was a time when we were seeing a lot of these coming in, and it seemed like that's why the parliamentary committee decided to take this up. Right now, I think they did this through the pandemic, and finally, sometime last week, these reports were tabled in the parliament.
Right, excellent. So I think, as I mentioned in the introduction, I sort of look at this report, and my initial thoughts are there's a bunch of stuff that I don't agree with, and there's stuff that I don't see in the report, which I think would have been good to put in. So let's start with the stuff that's actually in the report. Prateek, can you take us through the key recommendations here, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so let me start with, I think, the one that scared me the most, right? Which was essentially the parting shot of the report talking about selective banning, right? Which basically said that, so it seems to be coming from the place that, look, internet shutdowns impose a cost on a lot of people. They're not able to carry out various type of activities because your entire access to the internet is restricted. And so they sort of recommend that if you're worried about rumors and things like that, then why not just ban the services on which you have these rumors, right? And I think they specifically mentioned Facebook, WhatsApp, Telegram, etc., right? So it indicates two things, right? One is a lack of understanding of how the internet functions, and two, how people use the internet, right? How that works out. Because if you ban particular services or you block them, people will there will be many ways to circumvent that. You can use VPN, you can do a whole bunch of other things, which you won't go into details of. And there's also the fact that, look, if a service is periodically blocked, maybe people find other ways about it, especially your motivated, in quote, malicious actors. They'll find other ways to get their messages across. And we had a national experiment recently, right? When Facebook had an outage and the number of businesses, etc., that were affected for that 6-hour period, right? So it's not like you can just say, hey, we'll restrict these two services and expect that people's lives will not be affected in any way. Now you can argue that, one service, it's not ideal for everyone or for a lot of people to be dependent on the one particular company, but that's a slightly separate conversation. Right? Yeah, so there is the selective banning aspect of it.
So on top of the selective banning aspect, the report also talks about the compliance with the Supreme Court order bit of it. And that goes on two ways. So one is with respect to the Anuradha Bhasin judgment, where essentially the court laid out that there is a right to access the internet, not necessarily right to internet, but once you have access to the internet, there people have a fundamental right to use that as part of the exercise of their fundamental rights, such as freedom of speech. And the freedom to work, of employment, all of that. So that was one bit of it. And the other part of it is with respect to the temporary suspension of telecom services rules, which are the rules based on which suspensions have happened after 2017. So this rule itself, it took years to come in place. So until these rules were in place, right, in 2017, till then, a lot of internet shutdowns that were happening that were based on orders under 144 of CRPC, which is basically the curfew orders. So within the curfew orders, the district magistrates had the right to have, not necessarily the right, but that was the procedure used to order internet shutdowns. So the committee identifies that the temporary suspension of telecom rules, that itself is not very clearly laid out, and it is vast in its expanse, and it's not tailored to the mandates that have been laid down in the Anuradha Bhasin judgment. So where it was really pointed out that there are no adequate safeguards within the rules. So the rules are an exhaustively executive laden bit of the framework is exhaustively on the executive side, and it does not talk about any sort of oversight. The oversight part of it comes from a review committee, which the IT committee identifies that there are barely any review committees, and with the specific point that Prateek mentioned of the CAA protest, and during that time the committee seems to have reached out to the state government of Delhi, the NCT, the National Capital Territory, and the government seems to have responded, one, that they had not promulgated any orders for internet shutdowns, and two, that they do not have a review committee, because the review committee is supposed to review the orders within 5 days of the order being passed, which is not happening anywhere. So even within the review committee, the review committee framework itself, the IT committee finds that it is because it's heavily ridden with the executive, that there is no judicial oversight, while the parties, as in the MHA and the DOT, who have submitted to the inquiries made by the IT committee, they seem to be saying that there are legal secretaries who are, ex district judges or people with judicial training, but the committee seems to be more or less rightly saying that that is not adequate safeguard. And
Yeah, I thought that was really funny, right? That they tried to pass that off as the fact that, hey, look, these are retired judges, so it's not completely executive. But go on, Sapni. I just thought it was really funny that they were trying to do that.
Yeah, I think to talk about funny things, there are a lot of funny things that way within these responses that the departments have given. So that's majorly where the committee says that the current structure of the 2017 rules are not tailored well to fit, to answer the conditions laid down by the Anuradha Bhasin judgment, or the rules by themselves are not a good framework to use to understand and to limit the misuse of internet shutdowns by governments.
And another thing that struck me, I think, was the fact, the bit about, maintaining official data, right? And I think studies, etc. So just the fact that I think both the Department of Telecom and Ministry of Home Affairs said, hey, we don't have this information centralized anywhere. It necessarily the states that do it. So we don't have this. There isn't a single source of truth for this, right? Now, there are trackers, right? Like I think SFLC maintains the internet shutdowns tracker, right? And then there was this reference to the fact that there have been no studies about how other democratic countries, right? And they mentioned, I think, US, UK, and the EU, that how whether they've done shutdowns and what their position is. Right? And again, I found that there was potentially opportunity there to reference the report that Access now puts out every year, but we didn't see that. At least I didn't see that happen. There were odd references to newspaper reports that said this, but I think that was I think just general comment on the report, right? That there were opportunity to cite those data sources to provide the scale of the problem, but that didn't seem to happen.
I think all of that's quite pertinent and quite telling in some sense. But I want to discuss more about this and stuff that's not in the report. But before we do that, let's take a quick commercial break.
Hey, everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Wars and Warriors, Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramanian takes listeners on a trip with the race to Dhaka and some of the most crucial moments from the lightning campaign of Bangladesh. On Think Fast, Varun and Suchita drop some hot takes on NFTs, music, and the rise of social commerce. On Ikaduka Economy, Abhinav Trivedi and Dr. Bharat Junjunwala, author and ex-professor IIM Bangalore, discuss war and its effects on our daily lives. On Shunya One, we spoke to Alok Goyal. He's a partner at Stellaris Venture Partners. We discussed why SaaS works well for India. And on All Things Policy, the Takshashila folk discuss Australia's anti-trolling bill aimed at making social media platforms safer, but perhaps a little less private. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And also do check out our YouTube channels. We have a number of them. You can get them on ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And remember, if you're enjoying this show, or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. It really does help us spread the word. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors for the network this week: Cred, Bank of Baroda, CoinSwitch, Kuber, Intel, and Oxfam India. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back to All Things Policy. I'm here with Prateek and Sapni talking about the Standing Committee's report on internet shutdowns. And one of the things that struck me while going through this extremely detailed report, it's 83 pages, which is quite something. It's the lack of consultation and the lack of definition that was quite clear to me. So, Prateek, how about you elaborate on some of the stuff that could have been defined better or defined at all?
No, so they pointed out that, I think specific terms like public safety and public order, right, which are used to as justification for internet shutdown, those aren't necessarily clearly defined, right? So they pointed out, I think the Department of Telecom said it refers to the Telegraph Act, right? But even in the wording of the statute there, and something probably better place to interpret it. But it basically seems like the term public order and public safety are not clearly defined. So it seems like the Ministry of Home Affairs position was, hey, look, you have to read the section as a whole, and that helps you get a sense of it. And so that talks about the sovereignty of India, friendly relations with neighbors, and stuff like that. Right. So they basically say if you read the whole thing, you get a sense of it. But I think the committee went back and said that, look, it doesn't seem like this criteria is clearly defined, which then leads to arbitrary use of these. Specifically pointed out things like the fact that it's used to prevent cheating in exam. Right? That's not necessarily a public order or public safety issue in any way.
And I think the very important bit, coming back to funny things that are found in the report. So when the committee goes on asking for what are exactly the definitions, and within the law itself is very vague in that respect. So the MHA and the DOT, they keep going back to saying that we are deriving it from the law, and while the question itself is of the lack of clarity in the law, the fact that they respond only with the statements that this is the law, but the question being, what does it mean in the law, that they have no sorts of nothing in the lines of SOPs or nothing they can produce in to back up their statements in the form of judicial precedents. That shows very poorly about the understanding of what the grounds for internet shutdowns could be. Rightly, as Prateek pointed out, it could be right now, it could be anything from a preemptive order to giving preemptive orders to prevent education in exams, cheating in exams, to local. There have been also instances, if I remember rightly, of local festivals and local big drama that happens in smaller localities, which need not necessarily translate into having a public order issue. These are used there also. So it's absolutely no clarity on, nobody has that clarity on what is a public emergency or what is a public order problem which can translate into law and order. While even under the definitions and even under the interpretations of 144 CRPC, the courts have gone into these details multiple times.
That's quite interesting. Can we actually now move on and talk about consultations, the representation of civil society, and also 144 CRPC? So, Sapni first and then Prateek.
So actually, I want to make a point about the consultation thing, right? Sorry, Sapni. Very quickly. So because and I found that funny because again, one of the things that we found funny. So the committee points out, right, that the rules etc. were framed without consultation, right? Even the amendments that were made last year, it seemed like the only other department that was consulted was the Ministry of Law and Justice, right? There didn't seem like there was any consultation with, at least not put on the record, right? Any consultation with civil society, with telecom operators, and things like that, right? So it makes reference to this point. It also talks about the fact that look, maybe a review committee, right? And as Sapni noticed, right, they had pointed out that they are very executive heavy. That potentially there is scope to expand these to include, I think, telecom service providers. I believe they said eminent citizens, and even local MPs and MLAs, right? Just trying to get more stakeholders involved, which is interesting because if you look at the witness list of the report itself, right, the only people that have been called as witnesses were representatives of various state governments and I think the DOT and the MHA. Right. So the report itself did not seem to invite any civil society, witnesses, right? Any witnesses from there. Now, benefit of doubt, I know this was during the pandemic and the committee is not allowed to do, not allowed to call witnesses via video conferencing. So potentially that may have played a role, but I found this just the lack of representation of witnesses from civil society, from people who've been working on it. I found, I'd say disappointing, even though I'm giving them a little bit of benefit of doubt, but I found that bit disappointing.
And I think even on the witnesses list, the states, right, even with respect to the states, not all states have been consulted. And this has not been a very well done process. There is scope for so much improvement in the consultation part of it. And as Prateek's rightly identified that. I think I'll just go on to the 144 CRPC bit, which the committee has given quite some attention to, on the fact that 144 CRPC has been used multiple times. Even while the telecom suspensions rules exist, the committee identifies that states and local authorities continue to use 144 CRPC to have impromptu internet shutdowns, which right now, on by law, it should be illegal. It should not be legally, it should not be lawful, at least. So that is something, and the committee asks for the DOT and the MHA to create awareness amongst these local authorities so that they know this is not to be done. It's the wrong application of law. But what I find interesting is that after all these years, this sort of communication has not happened to local authorities, and this reminds me heavily of 66A, right? Like Section 66A of the IT Act, which the court struck down, and at least till last year, there have been cases registered under that particular provision. So the absence of understanding of what procedure is to be followed for things that the state in its executive capacity does, the absence of that is quite striking. And on top of that, I think the committee also talks about the lack of safeguards, which I briefly mentioned earlier. Safeguards within the law, within the rules, within the suspension rules, and how essentially it makes way for suspension in very trivial matters as well. So that the lack of safeguards, and that's where this connects to the point of consultations that Prateek was making, that if there are safeguards to be put in, if there are concerns of this kind to be raised, the committee and the drafters of the law, the executive in its drafting rules, has to reach out to people who are researching on things like this, who are actively involved in the process, which includes the ISPs and which includes other local members of parliaments and members of legislatures, etc., who are involved in these conversations and who can make good contributions so that there is robust law in place. So I think that is something good that the committee has identified, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, and just to build on that point, right, about safeguard, because I think one clear example of that is the fact that the amendment said that they can't be that the I think the orders can be issued for a maximum of 14 days at a time or 2 weeks at a time, and the way around that was just to keep reissuing orders. So I mean the 2 week bit was essentially rendered meaningless, right? The 2 week limitation was essentially rendered meaningless if you can just keep renewing these orders, like you renew a subscription every couple of weeks. And something we were discussing this earlier, right? I think you raised this point about in terms of grounds for lifting orders, that there isn't any clear way to judge, whether the situation on the ground has changed. What parameters are you judging the situation on the ground on to say, okay, that now these orders can be lifted or not, right? And the other bit was about, I think, even the effectiveness of suspension, right? As an intervention, how effective are they, right? So I think it cites some reports from the COI about, which said that I think they lose something to the tune of, I think, 24.5 million rupees an hour, right? And then they quoted in quotes newspaper reports, going back to my point about citation, that I think India lost somewhere around 2.8 billion USD in 2020 because of internet shutdowns, right? Because of various shutdowns. So I think uh, there's that, right? And then they point out that, look, I think they asked the department, have you done any studies to show is there a relation between imposing internet shutdown and communal rights, correlation there, right? And the DOT, MHA both seem to have done no such reports. For those interested, I think it was Jan Isaac who has done a report on this, and it seemed like the committee references it without really naming it, right? Without really naming the report, which is a general issue that I have with this with the report, right? They seem to have cited sources or things without really being clear, right, of what you're citing, and which I think is important for a report of this magnitude, right? Which is putting things on the public record. Minor rant, but you can't say things like newspaper reports or reports have that we received suggested this, right? I think it's important to, especially for things that are already in the public domain. I think it's very important to cite that stuff, right?
Yeah, and I think I'll go back to that point which Prateek was making about the lifting of internet shutdown. So it is pretty, it's pretty amusing that we have an entire system, even though it's not very well made. We have the system for internet shutdowns, but what happens after that? On what grounds do you lift it? When do you lift it? There is absolutely no clarity on that within this framework, and that is something we should be going back to, taking away. That's a big takeaway from this report that people should be concerned about at this point. And also, kudos to the committee. I think it's the first time that some official acknowledgement has happened in India from any part of the government that India leads internet shutdowns in the world, and that really should add to the concerns that we have about the nature of about how we deal with the internet and internet governance at large. And I think one I'd like to add on to this is how the committee identifies there are no definitions of public order or public emergency, which is basically the reasons why these internet shutdowns are made. I think we've briefly touched on that earlier, but it effectively shows, even after multiple attempts, that we haven't quite gotten down to a reason, which again, contributes to the point of effectiveness that Prateek was making. We haven't gotten down to a reason why we have internet shutdowns.
Right.
So it seems like the answer to that is, reasons, right? We have internet shutdown because reasons.
I'm sure the reasons themselves are very, very convincing for us to believe them. But let's sort of move on to degrees of internet shutdowns, and it's something I don't think this report acknowledges. I think you want to talk about how shutdowns are not the only problem here, but also this could be applied to throttling, and how it's applied here.
Yeah, I'm a little. This part is a little open to interpretation, right? I don't know if the committee interpreted internet shutdown very literally, or they just just bucketed everything under this term, but then they don't seem to have clarified that, right? And I'm referring to two particular things, right? One was right after the Anuradha Bhasin judgment in January 2020. For about a period of 2.5, 3 months in Jammu and Kashmir, we had this allow list kind of regime in place, right? Where only certain websites were allowed. And, we've done a podcast on that earlier. I think we can include that. But so there was that, right? It basically showed that, that's not how the internet works. You can't whitelist you can't allow just a few websites and think that everything will work fine. The other aspect which doesn't seem to find mention was, any reference to the fact that there was throttling of the internet, right? Mobile internet in Jammu and Kashmir to 2G speeds, which meant that yes, there was internet access, but you couldn't do a lot of things, right? And this was a topic of, or this was a petition in the Supreme Court. It was a pretty significant situation, right? Over through the pandemic. Just to make my position clear on this, I did submit an affidavit with an analysis to the Supreme Court as part of that petition. Cards on table, so you know where I stand on this. But the point remains that it doesn't seem like these were referenced in anywhere or acknowledged, right? And I thought that was interesting because even in Delhi, right? I think earlier this year, we had instances where I think the mobile internet was throttled to 64 kbps, right? And that was the first time they actually came out and said what the speed they were throttling it down to. Right. And so this goes to this degrees of ways that you can disrupt internet access, right? And that doesn't seem to have been acknowledged, at least in this way. And there was one bit about, I think, where the state government of Bihar referenced that they had SOPs saying that, government internet providers will not be affected and certain, those services will not be affected. I'm not entirely sure what that means, right? But even there seems to be some element of selective access. But apart from that, the report itself doesn't acknowledge or doesn't reference this allow list regime or throttling, right, as potential ways of disrupting internet access for citizens in there. And I thought it was significant enough to have either been called out separately or at least referenced in the sense that, hey, look, we're including this under the types of internet shutdowns that happen in the country.
That's very interesting. Let's see if either Prateek or Sapni have any concluding thoughts before we end.
Yeah, I think the takeaway that we have multiple takeaways from this report, but definitely the report could have contributed a lot more, could have done so much better. And I think within the sphere that it operated within, the limitations of the pandemic, of the parliamentary rules that are weird, that it can't reach out to stakeholders through video conferencing softwares, etc. I think there are takeaways, but we need to take this report with a pinch of salt and the strong belief that there is so much more work to be done. And we can't be ignoring the aspect that the internet works in a certain particular way. And it functions for all of us in a certain particular way, and it can't be dumped down into something way simpler. And the analogy for thinking about the internet can't be a book that can be shut down and closed off.
Yeah, so I'm pretty conflicted about this report, right? In the sense that, look, the fact that the report exists, I think, is a positive, right? That this really important topic that affects people in many ways, right, has been studied. I think that is a good thing. I have reservations about, I think, some of the recommendations. I started off with the selective banning thing, I think, and to some extent the breadth and the depth of some of the things that the report went into. But having said that, it also made important points about a lack of definition, etc., which I think are significant, and hopefully this is like a first step to addressing those. But yeah, so overall I stand a little conflicted on the whole thing.
Right. On that note, let's end this. Thank you, Prateek and Sapni, for joining us, and thank you, dear listener, for always being a part of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.
A wise man once said, traveling, it makes you speechless, then turns you into a storyteller.
Well, listen to such travel stories and experiences exploring India on the Musafir Stories with us, Saif and Faiza.
Catch us on the IVM website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Have you ever wondered where the business world is headed? How the ways in which we create, market, and sell to consumers will evolve? Or if we'll ever go back to wearing pants while working? For answers to all of this and more, tune into Advertising is Dead with me, Varun Dugirala. Every Tuesday, as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond. You can catch all episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.